It's a real privilege to be here. I want to thank Abraham for teaching me how to tie a bow tie again. I had forgotten how to do it. So actually, we got pictures to show it. He took me into the restroom. We worked through it. After 3 tries, I finally got it somewhat correct. And by the way, Eric, I am an adjunct at Stanford, so I can proudly wear the Stanford tie in addition to the Duke tie. So I do have a few comments to make. I'm not sure I'll be popular when I finish this, but that's okay. After being FDA commissioner, you get used to getting shot at every single day and dealing with it. This is just a list of my conflicts, and in this kind of a topic, people tend to talk about industry, like the medical products industry are the bad guys and the academic centers are the good guys. I'm going to tell you, I don't really think it quite works that way. I would say right now, being at an academic medical center may be the biggest conflict in terms of the change that's needed to fix the problems that we currently have. These were my assigned questions, real simple questions to address. The balance of innovation and safety, issues at stake when we decide what to regulate, current standards of proof, and this concept of software as a medical device. So I'll go through this, not exactly in that order, but hopefully you'll have some perspective to think about with regard to each of these questions. The bottom line for me, and this conference is evidence of it, the train's left the station, things are going to happen. You can't hold back the engineers. They're taking over the world. But we're all responsible. And, the way I like to think about it, just like traditionally, it's been really important and too often forgotten that ethics is too important to leave to ethicists. That is, we need to be thinking about ethics in everything that we do. I would say the quality and ethics of the fourth industrial revolution for sure are too important to leave to technology or medical products companies. Based on what's already been said, I probably don't need to try to convince you of that, but I'll try to hammer that home. And my personal view is that the greatest societal entity that's been asleep at the wheel is universities in terms of dealing with this. Universities are spawning the technology development, the fourth industrial revolution, but they're doing almost nothing to provide guidance, and yet exist in a privileged position by society as not-for-profits for the purpose of convening people with different points of view to provide guidance to society. So just to refresh your memory about the 4 industrial revolutions, and I do think, this has been a remarkable conference from people predicting that we are on the verge of what could rightfully be called an industrial revolution. This is terminology for those of you who haven't focused on this. It's being promulgated by the World Economic Forum, which I, having been there this year, I like to think of as a place where millionaires tell billionaires what the middle class is like. And, but they're pretty smart people, and they have a pretty broad view of where things are headed. So, I think right now we're sort of with regard to the use of information where people were right before water and steam power was brought into place. If you think about all the work that went into how to make factories work better without any power at all other than human labor, that got us to a certain place. And then the second industrial revolution was electricity. And again, I still, whether the quote is true or not, I still love it about people telling Henry Ford that you just needed to get horses to run faster, that was the solution to the problem of transportation. And then I think we're still recovering from the third industrial revolution. We haven't really absorbed the concept of using information technology to optimize the performance of the individual. And much of the talk today was more about the performance of the individual than where things are headed, although many people pointed to where things are headed. And the fourth is this fusion of biological, physical, and information sciences. And I live this strange lifestyle now of half-time at a university where I'm surrounded by brilliant people like Eric. I have to say, I sort of feel like I should go back to being a student after hearing what he had to say today. He's not, he can do the operation and do the coding and talk about it. It's really a remarkable thing. And then the other half of the time I'm at Verily in the Google environment trying to absorb and figure out how all that works. But It's really clear that not just in the kind of healthcare things that we're discussing today, the clinical side, but even the science side of drug discovery is being revolutionized by the digital era. And, it's entertaining to me to hear people talk about AI as if AI is actually the main part of this. AI, to me, is a small manifestation of a much bigger revolution in computing that I don't pretend to understand, but the latency, the change in latency of information and the connectedness and the ability to move information per se, independently of which quantitative method you choose. And it'll be interesting to see how the quantitative methods really settle out over time. This may be more important. So considerations in regulating AI, my assigned topic. I think it's pretty obvious this can't be regulated the old-fashioned way. Keep in mind the beauty of the old-fashioned way of regulation that evolved over decades of catastrophic public health events in the United States is that you can rummage around in the development phase of medical products all that you want to, as long as you can get through an ethics committee and have something that makes sense. But the result of your study is completely irrelevant until you do the confirmatory study, which has to be designed and executed prospectively on an independent population of people intended to represent those whom you intend to use the technology on or with as things evolve. But here we've got a technology that's complex, iterative, multifactorial with a very short latency. It's obvious that if every time your AI algorithm changed, you had to stop it and have the FDA do an evaluation of whether it was working, you'd have a problem. And in addition to that, the proportion of the entire population, even the scientific population, that can actually understand what's under the hood and the way it works is very, very small. And the FDA itself has a limited cadre of experts. And without going into details, people who live in rarefied places like this, and I'll be lambasting you even further later, tend not to want to work in Washington, D.C. for half of the quarter of the salary in a situation where it's illegal for you to have any interaction with anything that could possibly make money. So there's a limited cadre of experts within the FDA who can deal with this. This leads to a situation where the old way is not fit for purpose, but I would argue that despite claims to the contrary, this is an enormous nuclear weapon with tremendous potential for negative consequences. And only some of those are now unearthed. And I've predicted publicly, so I can say it again, if you look at the history of the FDA, the way things eventually get regulated approximately correctly is you sort of watch and see what happens, and then a catastrophic event occurs. And there's an overreaction by Congress that leads to inhibiting regulation, and then it gets evened out over time to be correct. And I think that will happen. And just think about wrong dose of a drug and decision support. And if you think doctors who say, where people say it's just assisting the doctor, if you think doctors are considering every consequence of every one of those decisions in today's environment, I would invite you to make rounds, as Eric said, and see what it's really like. And then so that's this distinction, as I call it, between decision control and decision support. Decision support is getting a pass right now, as I'll go into a little more detail on. And I think that's the right thing to do, but we're going to learn that as it gets better and better, it can either do tremendous good or tremendous harm. And we will have to develop methods to figure out ahead of time which is which. Because doing it after the fact, as I keep reminding engineers in the Google environment, it's different if your algorithm leads someone to buy the wrong pair of shoes compared to your algorithm leading them to recommend a healthcare practice or a decision that's adverse to health that leads to dead people. And anyone who's been in the drug development business knows the feeling when your best intentioned drug kills people in a way that you never could have anticipated. So the bottom line here to me, again, I'll just say it over and over, we all have a role to play. This is not something that can be left to the FDA, because the FDA fully recognizes throughout that it can't handle this the old-fashioned way. It's not possible to do it. The good news in other areas is I think drug development, it actually works pretty well. You know, the system keeps being refined, but this system of stopping at a certain point, analyzing what you have, proving that what you profess to sell people actually has a human benefit, at the core of it is a very good system that we need to emulate as much as we can in this field, but it's going to have to be done a different way. So if you think it's not possible to do harm, I would just urge you to think pretty carefully about this. And for those of you comfortably sitting in an academic environment, remember that the genesis of the current problem is a professor at Cambridge University who was given access to data in some kind of an agreement based on certain terms that apparently weren't kept. Now, I don't know the details beyond that. But it's not just that, this is a problem for Facebook. It's a problem for all of us. And I'm particularly motivated by this recent publication. And as often happens when I talk to Dr. Topol, he is I don't know how he does it actually. He appears to me to get up about 2 in the morning and read everything that was published that day. Like today, he was talking about some article that just came out today. Well, how did he know that? But he agreed with me that at least as best we can tell by current methods, this is an accurate article, and I think it's profound for what we're talking about today. And the bottom line here is that untrue stories reach more people faster and last longer than truthful stories. And so now if you say, we've got this thing called AI that almost no one can understand, and it's going to give us predictions and allow us to micro-target people very specifically as to who they are to affect their behavior, their social habits, and now the prescribing and routines that doctors go through. And you can make it up, and most people won't know that it's made up because it's so hard to figure out. And by the way, we can't regulate it because it's too glorious and fancy for the FDA to deal with. I think we'd better be careful about how we think about this and get involved with it. And this is a particularly startling quote, but after talking with a number of people last night, I got motivated just to show it because I think it's hard to argue right now that most of the American public, at least, feels comfortable knowing what's true and what's not true out of what they're reading and seeing on television or on the internet, much of it directed by AI algorithms that are targeting divisions among people purposely. And, should it be regulated? I would say probably should be. How should we do it? I don't think anybody has any earthly idea. Where are the universities? They have law schools, they have ethics departments, they have medical schools. Where are they in this discussion? The consequences for health, I would say, are profound. And no, this is not the election map. This is a map of life expectancy in the United States by county. Looks a little bit like the election map, doesn't it? Well, it correlates very closely with the election map, it turns out. And you can't see this amount of detail here, but I've been on a tour of southeastern states, which are in this bright red category, where I'm from and where I live. Red means bad here, if you consider living longer to be good. Red is living shorter. But if you look within each of these red spots, if you go to a town which has a major university, it's a blue dot in the middle of the redness of the rest of those states. I've been to Birmingham, Nashville, Raleigh-Durham, Charlottesville, all the same, Atlanta, all the same patterns that you see. And it's hard to argue that people don't have access to information because the poorest people in the United States, just like the rest of the world, all have cell phones armed with just an unlimited amount of information. Well, if you're not already alarmed, what really should get you alarmed is this is the trajectory of life expectancy. So this is not a static phenomenon. the parts of our country that are doing worse are getting worse at a relatively fast rate. The well-to-do, educated, fabulously rich people like those who live here are doing better and living longer. And in fact, if you look at Google searches by red and blue counties, the big ones in places like this are 401ks, exercise equipment, exercise outfits, and gifts for relatives. It's kind of a nice life you have here. In the other part of the world where I live, in the red areas, and let me just admit up front, Raleigh-Durham is not exactly a red area. It's guns, pickup trucks, religious rapture. Two different worlds and evolving at a rapid pace, very much affected by targeted information. Now, how much, I don't know, and that's going to be a key national issue. All right, so now to get it back to sort of hardcore medicine, just to make the point again, there's just no way the FDA can do it the old-fashioned way. If you just look at diagnostic testing, it used to be pretty easy. Some academic would be in a lab, develop a biomarker, it would become a test, it would be studied, and then its characteristics would be worked out, and the FDA could make a decision about the test. Next generation sequencing, 3.2 billion tests all done at the same time. We had some fun with Francis Collins calculating the number of thousands of years it would take at the current pace of technology to understand the meaning of the polymorphisms that can currently be measured. By his estimate last year, it was about 1% of the polymorphisms are understood now in terms of what the clinical consequences are. So we need something different. And just as we're reeling from that, I'm part of an enterprise, and here I'm triply conflicted. I'm a Duke faculty member, a Stanford faculty member, and I'm the sponsor of this study. But our intention in Project Baseline at Verily with these academic institutions is to map the human existence all the way from genes to the genome and integrated physiology to the clinical evaluation, and then into behavior, social, geographic, environmental interactions as measured with cell phones and watches and other data ingesting instruments. So the amount of data is going to really proliferate in a way with an intention of helping people with their health. But again, the need, I think, to have guardrails that society determines about what should be done with this powerful data. So now, just while I'm preaching to everybody, I'll just sort of chide every part of the ecosystem now. So regulatory agencies, do have the primary mission of protection. I actually do believe that there can be congruence between protection and promotion of innovation, but it's not innovation in the sense of typical software development, which I'm not an expert in, but I've gotten to see now for 8 months in my life at Verily. Software innovation, you can mess around and screw it up. It's not affecting anybody. You can't do that in this arena. And so you've got to have some threshold, some barrier that keeps bad stuff from getting to people to the extent that you can. And where that threshold should be, I think, is a huge issue that's not yet determined, but I'll show you more about it. There are other federal agencies involved, but the key thinking on this is that we need a system where we have entities that we can trust. And I can just tell you, if I could tell a story once a day from inside the FDA of what we see, it's a tiny fraction in every part of the industry, but for every chance to make money, there is a tiny fraction of people that you cannot trust. And they can do very devastating things to people. And so the system, in addition to saying we're good people, actually needs to verify that it can be trusted. And we all have a stake in that because people in Washington can't keep track of all this. So I've just listed some things that are important there. And one of the most important ones, I think, is stimulating the ecosystem. If you go on the internet today for diagnostic testing about, let's just take diabetic retinopathy, you will see a number of completely false claims and people selling things with, as Eric said, no published literature, but not even applications to regulatory agencies because internationally you don't need to have it. We can see people in California selling stem cells to unsuspecting customers for 10,000 bucks a shot with all kind of claims about what's being done to those stem cells in the way of the use of technologies. I could go on and on. So we need to be active in this. This is sort of a look at how the FDA is thinking about it. If there was a way to have a TSA pre-check, that's what we'd really like. I say we still have great allegiance to the mission of the FDA. So people should be thinking in places like this and companies that are involved here, how do we develop a transparent system where it can be trusted? Where in a situation where most people want to understand the math and the algorithm, that you can believe that what's being done is not only technically correct, but also provides benefits that outweigh the risks. And then that would allow a lot of post-market review. But the critical factor here is that the post-market evaluation needs to include clinical outcomes. It needs to include the question, if you have an algorithm that gives you an accurate prediction, does it lead to things that are good or bad for people? And the only way to measure that is through clinical outcomes. And we are so far from that right now that there could be a lot of harm done before it was picked up by these algorithms. So in thinking about this, I think we've come to a sensible place now. And it was quite an experience to go through 21st century cures with a lot of industry lobbying to have no regulation of algorithms. But I think what we came up with and agreed to in law now is a pretty reasonable situation where if what you're doing is helping operations, aggregation of information, it's not a regulatory issue for the FDA. What you're doing is informing people about how to stay healthy, like how many steps you took today, and it's not diagnosing or treating a disease, then that's off the table. And then 21st century cures, it actually is taken completely off the plate of the FDA. But if what you're doing is diagnosing or treating a disease, then it is an FDA purview. But the stated policy of the FDA is enforcement discretion, which means we're going to watch it, and we're not going to slow it down because innovation is critical. But we'll keep a close eye on it, and if we get reports of bad things or we begin to learn about it, then we can always step in. If you have an algorithm that's telling your defibrillator when to fire, that will be regulated as part of a medical device, just like any other kind of regulation. So that's currently where we are. Now again, this is just to make the point that it doesn't matter what industry we're in, and I actually don't put the AI cartel in any higher esteem than the drug industry or the device industry. People whose lives are tied up in something they think is really good have a really hard time seeing the downside of what they're doing. And it just seems so obvious that it will work. But you know, again, just in yesterday's JAMA, I'm not like Eric, I can't quite do today, but I did see yesterday's. There's another great study showing that decision support and more frequent blood pressure measuring using digital technology at home had no impact on overall blood pressure control. Doesn't mean it couldn't eventually work. It didn't do harm, but you know, things that seem obvious just sometimes don't work. And built into this at the FDA is a view that we need the ecosystem to be involved in continuous learning, always thinking about what it's doing, always measuring. And I'm really proud of Eric for the way he described it. This is not a part of the history of Duke Medical Center to actually keep evaluating what you're doing if it seems to work. And I hope we'll be able to maintain that rigor. This will obviously not work unless we break down the barriers that currently exist with electronic health records. All right, what about clinicians? It's time to seize the day. I've heard many calls to that effect. I actually don't subscribe to the view that we need to take it back. I'm not sure the good old days were quite so good. The disparities in health outcomes that existed in the U.S. before the time we could measure them were probably quite profound. And those great doctors who had those great patient relationships probably gravitated to people who could afford to pay for their services or otherwise interact with them in ways that were favorable. And I would say the desire of doctors to make money has been a big part of what's happened. It's not a small part of it. So, you know, we have to trust and verify, and we have to think about redefining our roles. But I don't think doctors should be in control. I think doctors should have a bigger voice. And I like the word participatory that I heard several people use. Professional societies, for some specialties, this is an urgent matter. If you're a radiologist, pathologist, or dermatologist, you are thinking about how your job is going to change, and I think that's good. For other specialties, this is a chance to improve professionalism, but that brings out the word professionalism. That was what came to mind, and it's great to be at this particular forum with such a visionary in the field. But one thing that really bedeviled me at FDA, there's a presumption in the law, in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics law, that the fiduciary interest of the doctor is in the patient. It doesn't look that way to me now. Doctors are dealing with populations in addition to individual patients, but that's okay. The real troublesome thing is that doctors are employees of corporations now. No offense to Dr. Harrington, but the pressure on RVUs and practicing docs and academic medical centers is higher today than it's ever been, which is quite a remarkable thing to have to say. But I can say that with great certainty because a lot of them are talking to me in my Verily role. So in a situation where you are being taken to task if you don't see enough patients quickly enough, and your ability to prescribe is limited by deals made between your health system and companies like PBMs, totally without transparency. That is, no one knows about the data that's exchanged between these entities. You got to question the word professionalism and what it really means. I long for the days of professionalism, and I'm happy to be proven wrong about this. Patient and consumer groups are really the great weapon of the FDA that it's really grown to love. And I'm not talking about groups paid for by industry to represent a particular drug, but groups like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which really demand that we do the right thing and work together to make information useful for the health of patients. And the reason I put this slide in is that we'd better be thinking about the groups that aren't so well represented. I think it's clearly demonstrable today. If you look at the areas where the most progress is being made in patient outcomes, it's areas with very strong patient advocacy. And since it's not exactly a zero-sum game, but it's not a totally additive game, the groups that don't have that kind of advocacy, I think, are really suffering. Just ask yourself about Stanford and Duke's commitment to mental health services relative to its commitment to cancer. Pretty big difference there. Matches pretty well with the income that can be made in those two areas and the advocacy that exists for those services. And then, so my main point is that I'm glad you're having this conference. Universities really need to wake up. There's a lot at stake. Policies and rules are going to be made because bad things will happen. They'll be made a lot better if there's been a lot of thought by the diverse interests that universities represent, and people get together and think about it, not only including the universities themselves, but the populations that exist in the areas where they exist. So Duke University, University of North Carolina, are part of a state that's fairly big, and part of the intention of universities is to interchange, I think, with those communities. And then finally, data scientists. Keep advancing the field. Please try to avoid hyperbole and bravado. Not that I heard any of it today, but maybe there was a little bit of a tone of that sometimes in what people had to say. We'll all get humbled. The teamwork that Eric talked about is something that we really need to work on. It's not giving someone an answer, it's working with a team of people to make sure the questions are the right questions. In the interest of time, I'm going to finish up here with this, which I would say is more important than the pure regulatory part. It's thinking through what are the moral obligations as we enter this amazing time where so much good could be done, but also so much harm could be done. And I'd refer you to the work of Cass and Faden and their group at Hopkins, who I think did a great job of sort of thinking through what the general principles should be for an ethical framework. But in closing, it's great to be here, and I hope meetings like this will continue with a focus not just on talking about what's possible, but what are the ways in which we can bend this tremendous activity towards human good and away from human harm. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Califf. What an amazing discussion and very powerful and touching on so many important points. A quick comment from Jesse Dunn. You talked a lot about, I think, made very excellent points, especially disparities and bias in marginalized populations who tend to just get left behind as we're trying to do new changes. What can we do differently then that acknowledges those and does something about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating for me, but I used to talk about disparities in terms of people who didn't look like me, but now the biggest change in America is rural, middle-aged white Americans who are seeing a dramatic increase in death rates. So there are many of us in this marginalized population, and I actually think it's not that they don't have access to information. It's, I think since this will continue, I think the most important thing is for really smart people like the people that are here to figure out how to use the technology to get people reliable, useful information and understand how to help them have behaviors which are good for their health. And that gets into a whole discussion of the possibilities of geospatial, time-oriented information, which is entirely in the realm of marketing now, but could very much be in the realm of health.
Very good. I mean, a lot more questions we could get into. I would encourage, we have a break now to invite much more discussion from there, and we'll see you again just after the break.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.